Hi, I'm Ted Morrissey, and I wanted to make a video for my Revisionist Shakespeare class. As you know, we are just getting started, and I thought it was a good idea at the beginning of the course, particularly, to try to get you to focus on something that otherwise you might not, and that is Shakespeare's language. As you know, we are primarily interested in the plays because of their potential for um, revision, their potential for uh, our finding plots and characters and the like that we can use for our own inspiration and our own writing. And we're going to be talking a lot more about that, obviously, as time goes by here. Um, and, particularly the fact that Shakespeare himself was a revisionist writer and so on. But as we get started, as I said, I wanted to call your attention to how Shakespeare uses language. Anyone who has had me as an instructor before knows that's one of my chief interests is how writers use language. As you probably also know, if you've had some experience with me, my literary idol is William H. Gass. And the thing that I fell in love with about Gass's writing and about his whole sort of aesthetic philosophy is his emphasis on language. The idea that the language must come first before worrying about plot, characterization, setting, any of that stuff. The writer's chief focus should be creating something beautiful with language. And I wholeheartedly believe that. It kind of changed my whole approach to writing. And, again, I'm sure I'll revisit that, more and more. But as we start to look at the plays, and as you know, we're going to look at Othello, we're going to look at The Winter's Tale, and we're going to look at The Tempest. Yes, we're interested in plot. We're interested in how Shakespeare develops character. We're definitely interested in how we might be inspired to write our own narratives, somehow connected to, based on Shakespeare's work, and so forth. But meanwhile, we should be paying attention to Shakespeare's language. And I want to draw from a couple of different sources here, actually, three different sources. One is this book, The Bedford Companion to Shakespeare, an Introduction with Documents, and it's by Russ McDonald. I used to teach a pretty standard introduction to Shakespeare undergraduate course at a different university several years ago, but for a couple of years I did that course, and we would do your pretty standard. We'd start off looking at the sonnets, and then we do some of the plays, kind of representative of the different genres and that kind of thing. But I also assigned this book because it has a lot of really useful and I think well worth considering kind of information. And one of the chapters that MacDonald has is on Shakespeare's dramatic language. And you guys want to, pull from this a little bit and then turn to Othello itself, which we're beginning with, and then talk a little bit about my own writing, how it's been affected by the kind of concepts that I am kind of pulling from here. All right. So, again, just kind of reading from MacDonald's text and just sort of, improvising on that as I go here. He writes that the unparalleled success of Shakespeare's stories and characters depends on the communicative power of Shakespeare's language. Once we become alert to the potential power of Shakespeare's words, especially to the sensuousness of their sounds and patterns, then we have access to pleasures and meanings that take us to the heart of his dramatic enterprise. So, one of the points that MacDonald makes is that Shakespeare was obviously a successful playwright. There were a lot of playwrights operating in London at this time period, and many of them were successful. But we don't tend to study those plays or remember those plays the same way that we do Shakespeare, perhaps largely because of Shakespeare's use of language. I just a couple of days ago learned a really interesting fact. I was watching a video with Emma Smith, who's a Shakespeare scholar. Actually, I've been aware of her work for years. I've read a couple of her books at least, and have watched her in several videos. And she is, among other things, Shakespeare related, a expert on the First Folio, the first collection of published plays. And something she said in a lecture I watched, actually kind of a Q&A kind of thing I watched a couple days ago, which I didn't know, was that from about 1640 to 1660, roughly, um, theaters were outlawed in London. Conservative elements in the government outlawed the public performance of plays, and that stayed in force for some 20 years or so. But then when that ban was lifted, and they wanted to reinstate public theater, they didn't have a lot of plays to draw from because nobody really had been writing them for a couple of decades. Now, there were some underground plays and things like that, but in terms of the kind of energetic writing of plays that was going on in Shakespeare's time, that hadn't been going on for 20 years. But luckily, they had the First Folio. And that, this part I did know, that it was very unusual for plays to be given the sort of treatment that Shakespeare's plays were given in the First Folio. And so, because you had this repository of some 3 dozen plays readily available because of the first and then subsequent folio printings as well, they drew from those plays starting in 1660 or so, and that really helped to kind of establish what became the Shakespeare canon. And so, whether or not it was the language to begin with that made the play so memorable, or maybe that's what led to the folio being published when so many other playwrights' work was not published in that way, maybe because of the language again. For whatever reason, Shakespeare, was the sort of the jumping off point for the revitalization of theater in London in 1660. And again, his use of language may very well be kind of instrumental to that. But getting back to McDonald here, he talks about how figurative language delights the senses and the intelligence by expressing one idea in terms of another, and in the hands of the greatest poets, the imagery employed for such expression is richly connotative, creating a network of pictures and ideas that resonates with other images, ideas, themes throughout the poem or the play, or I would say, story, novel, etc. Going on. Shakespeare's own vocabulary seems to have been exceptionally large, about 29,000 words, nearly twice that of the average American college student, which attests to his acquaintance with a far wider range of specific topics and terms than the modern reader usually commands. And of course, there's all kinds of reasons that Shakespeare's vocabulary was so robust. And one of those was that he use words in unusual ways, made up new words based on Latin roots and so forth. MacDonald goes on. He says, nowadays, as a rule, the subject appears first. We're talking about sentence structure. The subject appears first, then the verb, and then the direct object or complement. From Thomas Wilson and Francis Bacon in the 16th century to George Orwell and E.B. White in the 20th, prominent advocates for simplicity and clarity have shaped our concept of normal English syntax. So, what MacDonald's getting at here is that in Shakespeare's day, words could be put together in much more variety in terms of acceptable syntax. But in the 20th century, he cites Orwell and E.B. White. I would throw someone like Hemingway in there as well. There was this real push towards short sentences, simple syntax, clarity, and so on. And I think in some writing contexts, The striving for clarity is perfectly fine. I was a journalist for a number of years. That's kind of how I first kind of got involved in writing for publication and really got interested in putting words on the page in a way that might be attractive to others. And certainly in journalism, there is a tendency for simplicity and clarity, especially newspaper journalism, maybe more so than magazine or now webzine or website or whatever you want to call it, journalism. But when it comes to creative work, I really push back against that now. I didn't always. As I've said elsewhere, I really was heavily doused in Hemingway in high school and college just because of the time period that I grew up in. And so when I first started to write creatively, to write short stories and try to write novels and that kind of thing, I really was trying to write very Hemingway-esque kinds of sentences, short, simple, direct, that kind of thing. But then later on, and again, I'm going to attribute this largely to my discovery of William Gass, I went 180 degrees in the other direction. Um, Gass taught me not to be afraid of language, that writers should be using all of the tricks in the trade, right? Tricks of the trade, tricks in their basket, whatever you want to say. Um, Meaning that we oftentimes associate certain kinds of language use with poets and writing poetry, but there's no reason that prose writers can't employ those same kinds of techniques and devices, and it makes for the writing to be that much more interesting. And that's what Shakespeare was doing, 400 years ago. In terms of the way that he was using language. And what's interesting is that there's actually kind of a point in Shakespeare's career that we can see a sort of emergence of this sort of interest in this kind of writing. Let me fast forward just a bit here if I can. Yeah. So McDonald talks a lot about wordplay and puns, which tend to have kind of a bad rep in modern times. But as McDonald points out, there's actually lots of different kinds of puns, and some are just sort of silly for fun kinds of puns, but they can be words that really carry a lot of meaning and weight and have all sorts of double meanings and triple meanings and so forth and so on. And so then he gets into talking about language as theme. And he says, these several verbal forms and patterns serve as tools, affirmative instruments designed to move the audience, to give pleasure, to engage, to amuse, to excite. Around 1592 or 1593, Shakespeare seems to have experienced an epiphany, discovering more or less suddenly the almost limitless power of language. Our knowledge of dates is sketchy here, but we can still make a reasonable guess about which plays came at this time. And in works such as Love's Labour's Lost and Richard III, particularly, we observe a sudden explosion of rhetorical ability, a sense of exuberance, a power at what words can do. And again, when I read that, I think of my own sort of epiphany when I first read William Gass and realizing, oh my gosh, you can write short stories and novels and still use this really, highly charged language, with alliteration and rhyming and internal rhyming and repetition and rhythm and all this stuff. You don't have to be a poet, specifically to do that sort of thing. All writers should think of themselves as users of language in that way. Aristotle talked about poetry as any kind of creative work, not what we think of very narrowly as poetry or a poem, but anything that is designed as a creative work is a type of poetry. And that makes sense to me. And it also kind of obviously is in keeping with this idea that Gass always emphasized, that language should be used poetically, even if you're writing prose, right? So So again, as we go through the plays, and you're looking at all the other kinds of elements we tend to look at, characterization and plot and so on, pay particular attention to the language. And I just you can almost open up at any page of any of Shakespeare's plays and find great examples. And I practically, did that for the couple of examples I'm going to read to you here. But these are from, again, Othello, and this is Act 2, Scene 3. And I'm going to read a couple of passages of Iago's, one a little bit longish, and then the other one much, much shorter. But this is when he's talking to Roderigo and is just starting to kind of hatch his plot against Othello. But listen to his use of words, his use of language, and how powerful the imagery is in his language here, because he could communicate the sorts of things he needs to communicate to Roderigo and to the audience by using much simpler language. But I dare say 400 years later, we wouldn't be reading it, and I wouldn't be making a video talking about it had Shakespeare done that. So again, Act 2, Scene 3, Iago says, "And what's he that says I play the villain? When this advice is free, I give an honest probable to thinking, and indeed the course to win the Moor again." The course to win the Moor again. Listen to that internal rhyme. "For 'tis most easy the inclining Desdemona to subdue in any honest suit. She's framed as fruitful as the free elements. And then for her to win the Moor weren't to renounce his baptism, all seals and symbols of redeemed sin. His soul is so unfettered to her love that she may make, unmake, do what she lists." Let me back up just a minute. Listen to all that wonderful language. "'Tis most most easy the inclining Desdemona to subdue." Desdemona subdue in any honest suit. She's framed as fruitful as the free elements. So And then for her to win the Moor weren't to renounce his baptism, all seals and symbols of redeemed sin. So this multiplicity of the S sound. His soul is so infettered to her love that she may make, unmake, do what she lists, even as her appetite shall play the god with his weak function. How am I then a villain to counsel Cassio to this parallel course directly to his good? Divinity of hell! When devils will the blackest sins put on, they do suggest at first with heavenly shows, as I do now. For whiles this honest fool plies Desdemona to repair his fortune, and she for him pleads strongly to the Moor, I'll pour this pestilence into his ear, that she repeals him for his body's lust, and by how much she strives to do him good, she shall undo her credit with the Moor. So will I turn her virtues into pitch, that's into blackness, and out of her own goodness make the net that shall enmesh them all. So the imagery is powerful there, the word play. So I will turn her virtue to pitch, to blackness, which obviously plays with the idea of Othello's dark skin and all of those resonances that are going on in the play. The idea of out of her goodness make the net that shall enmesh them all. And so that's a powerful image as well, right? So language play, imagery, etc. And then on the very next page, after Roderigo has his bit, Iago says, and this is a little shorter business, "How poor they that have not patience! What wound did ever heal but by degrees? Thou knowest we work by wit and not by witchcraft, and wit depends on dilatory time. Dost not go well? Cassio hath beaten thee, and thou by that small hurt hath cashiered Cassio. Though other things grow fair against the sun, yet fruits that blossom first will first be ripe. Content thyself a while. By the mass 'tis morning. Pleasure and action make the hours seem short. Retire thee, go where thou art billeted. Away, I say, thou shalt no more hereafter. Nay, get thee gone. And then Rodrigo exits, and Iago says, two things are to be done. My wife must move for Cassio to her mistress. I'll set her on myself a while to draw the more apart and bring him jump when he may Cassio find soliciting his wife. Aye, that's the way. Dull not device by coldness and delay. All right. So just again, just wonderful, wonderful language, rhyming, and alliteration, and then just the imagery is just so powerful. And again, Shakespeare could have given us much simpler, easier to understand language, but it wouldn't be nearly as much fun to listen to, or to read, or for the actors to use, right? So again, I had this sort of epiphany of my own when I read William H. Gass's long story, novella, whatever you want to call it, in the heart of the country, and just his use of language, just like like a jolt of electricity when I read it. And again, for someone who was raised on Hemingway, this was really eye-opening to think that a writer of prose, a writer of fiction, could use language in this way, and it just opened up a whole vista of possibilities for me. Obviously, it hasn't led to great fame and fortune on my part, but it has led to my just enjoying writing so much more, and writing what I think is much better, more sophisticated, more interesting, whatever kind of verb you want to, or adjective you want to use, kind of prose. And so I'm just going to read brief a passage from my latest, most recent novel, The Artist Spoke. And this is a contemporary novel, which is a little bit unusual for me. Most of my work is sort of historically based, but this is the current time, roughly. And it's about some poets on the loose in Chicago. And I just want to read again a brief passage that uses, or I think demonstrates my use of poetic language in the service of prose, in the service of storytelling, right? And I know it's following Shakespeare is kind of difficult, so keep that in mind. But in this section of the novel, the two main characters, Chris and Beth, have gone to a bookstore in Chicago, and Chris, who's the main character, the main focus of the book, a guy. He's looking at the books and thinking about his own kind of development as a writer and a poet and all those kinds of things. And so I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs here. Right? And so he says, in high school, he discovered and devoured Kurt Vonnegut. Slaughterhouse-Five and Breakfast of Champions left their mark, of course, as did Mother Night, Galapagos, and Jailbird. It was Vonnegut's genre bending that most appealed to him, and the author's wit and wisdom. In college, it was Kerouac and the beats, the lyricism of On the Road, which transitioned into poetry, of Mexico City Blues and Dr. Sax, leading naturally to Ginsberg's Howl, hooking him on poetry just in time to switch his emphasis and initiate his tunneling backward into its tropes and traditions, its history, and its heroes and its heroines. By the time of his MFA, he'd returned to the 20th century poets, Plath and Hughes, Haney and Larkin, Lorca and Neruda, Nemiroff and Giovanni, Gale and Wilson, Eliot, Rilke, Valery, Bunting, Bishop, and more. Then there was the poetic prose of Elizabeth Winters and her determination to do something different. Elizabeth Winters is a made-up author, based on the real author, Shelley Jackson, but she's a kind of fictionalized version thereof. But she's one of the main focuses of the book. Getting back to the passage. If there was little left to do with language and its shape, according to narrative theory, then the new ground must be transmission. How will readers' reception of a text affect their processing of it? And what if that text remains largely hidden and readers can only process the hint of it, its mere shadow on the surface? Elizabeth Winters seemed to want to take Hemingway's iceberg principle, which dominated 20th century literature, to a new depth in the new century. Hemingway felt the characters' stories, their motivations, should remain mostly below the surface of what appeared on the page, directing the action from the characters' hidden depths. Elizabeth Winters went further. The narrative mechanisms themselves should disappear from view, leaving only their opaque outline for the reader, leaving the processing of their faintest fragments nearly the whole of the narrative itself. In more than one interview, she cited Samuel Beckett as an inspiration. He sat in a comfortable chair with his coffee and his newly selected journal and pen and book of prose poems, considering it all as Elizabeth Winters' last novel seethed beneath his skin. All right, so again, just a brief passage, but just maybe it's clear there that there's definite effort on my part to use devices that we might normally associate with poetry in the service of prose, in the service of storytelling. All right, so that's it. So as we're reading Shakespeare the next few weeks, along with all the other stuff, you're kind of sorting through, intellectually as you read the plays. Think about his use of language, and think about your own use of language as a writer. To me, as writers, as people who maybe have a particular gift with language, we should flaunt it, right? We should go ahead and use language to make our stories, our novels, whatever it might be, as engaging, as interesting as possible. I know when I pick up a book and start to kind of thumb through the pages, so many times nowadays authors are just using this really boring prose style. It's like a painter who will only paint with beige or something. It's like, come on, wake up. You use language the way I know you can. Do interesting things on the page. Experiment with syntax, experiment with poetic devices, and so forth and so on. All right, so consider all that. I'd be interested to know what you think about the poetic use of language, and whether it's appropriate in prose writing, or does it put some kind of a wall up between you, the writer, and the reader you're aiming at, that kind of thing. So I'll be interested to hear what you have to say.